Hi, everybody. I'm James Bennet. I write the Lexington column for The Economist, and I'm with Ken Walker, who's the president of Global Affairs for Google Alphabet, and Miriam Vogel, who is the president at EqualAI. And I guess I'd like to just begin pulling the lens back from the point, the sort of penultimate point they were discussing, which is the impact of society, on society, of this technology. So we're convened to talk about a hyper-competitive industry developing technology that moves faster than thought, and how it's going to work with a system designed to move slowly, as the congressman was emphasizing, to make sure we get the benefits of the technology and minimize risks. Pick the date in the future, 2030, 2040, 2050, looking backward. If we get it right, what does the world actually look like in that year?
I'll jump in on that one. I think it is a really amazing potential that we have in front of us. A few years ago, people were asking, they were saying they promised us driverless cars, and we got 140 characters. And I think there's a good argument in the next few years we'll see not only driverless cars, but an awful lot more, solving some of our largest social problems, addressing issues like climate change, or personalized medicine, or precision agriculture, or clean, fresh water around the world. Now, so if you go to 2040, 2050, the potential for those kinds of improvements is dramatic. Now, we have to do an awful lot to get there, to earn societal trust and lean into the notion of not just an opportunity agenda, but also a responsibility agenda, a security agenda. But if we do it right, the upsides are tremendous.
It's so hard to answer a question 7 years when, if you think back 7 months, the world looks so different. But it's an important exercise, so thank you for starting us there. It's important for us to imagine our end goal. Where do we want to be, and make sure to plan and iterate for that. I think that I agree with Kent. I think some of these seemingly intractable issues, whether it's early cancer detection and cures, climate change, I think those will hopefully be problems of the past. I think we're already seeing how AI is helping with forest fire detection and early lung cancer screening. We've seen at the Mass General very recently, really impressive success rates. But if that's our goal, we need to be very intentional now, build backwards, and make sure, are those cancer detection rates equally successful among different populations? So for whom are those the success rates, and for whom do we need to do better to make sure that they get there? But I also think the other thing we can expect is increasing seamlessness. I think that in the way that we now have an editor at our disposal,
Sorry about that.
At all moments of the day or night, within seconds, where we have these amazing LLM models editing our work. I think we have this amazing, powerful tool that, in the way that the iPhone changed our idea of, do you need a computer? Do you need a map? We all used to have these atlases in our car, and you'd have to bring the invitation on where you're going, and you'd have to it is all available in one, thank you so much, seamless space. I think, again, that's an area we can expect to be and needing to build backwards to make sure that that is an opportunity that we can all attain, whether we live here, whether we live in a rural area, whether we live in a place that currently doesn't have enough access to Wi-Fi.
And Miriam, staying with you, just because we have to play that out, let's hear the flip side of that. What is your fear of what that future could look like if in fact we don't get the right safeguards in place?
Yeah, I think if we are not thoughtful about the safeguards that we currently have in place, the laws that are on the books today, the new laws that we'll need to be thinking about, like some that Representative Liu just mentioned, we could be in a place where we have AI that is very powerful and we don't understand its limitations. If we're not intentional about for whom it is working, for whom who is seen by the AI, who is heard by the AI, and who is not, if we remove people too far away from the process and we don't maintain our commitment to keeping humans in the loop, then we have AI that builds recommendations and suggestions that we are overly reliant on without understanding that that is not a solution for every user.
And Ken, I have to, as a Gen Xer raised on the Terminator and Skynet, I have to ask you the darkest version. But I was just struck by Congressman Liu's reassurance. They felt the need to say that we don't face an extinction level threat right now. It's sort of interesting that anybody would even feel the need to kind of articulate that. What do you see as a realistic, pessimistic scenario for 2050?
I think there are buckets of concerns. In a funny way, you can worry about AI being too bad or too good. And either of those could erode social trust. So what do I mean by that? It could be bad in the sense of it's inaccurate. And by inaccurate, that could manifest in misinformation or disinformation, but also in bias and discrimination, which is in a sense a form of inaccuracy about all the diverse communities that we have around the world. It could be too good in the sense of rapid labor displacement, for example, or weaponization by people who mean us harm, cyber attacks and the like. So I think we need to have a balanced regulatory regime that takes into account some of these trade-offs and steers us toward the more positive path.
Ken, why are we having this conversation now? I mean, obviously ChatGPT and all the rest have focused people's attention on this, but we've been living with AI for a while. And this has been coming for a long time, and suddenly it really has just kind of seized the attention of the public, of the press, maybe that is and I guess it always makes me a little suspicious and wonders, are we hyping is this a fashion that all of a sudden we're all paying attention to this? We should have been paying attention a long time ago, or are we paying too much attention, taking it sort of out of proportion now? Or is the moment just right?
Yeah, a little bit of all the above. If you go to the Computer History Museum in Silicon Valley, you will see that the origins of what people now talk about, artificial intelligence, really machine learning, back in the 1950s. And there have been a whole series of AI winters and AI springs back and forth over those decades. We at Google really started focusing on some of the technologies that turned into these large language models that we're talking about now, starting about a dozen years ago. If you're a search company, you start out by trying to answer people's queries, connect words to words in the world. And those words have synonyms and related concepts, and you gradually start to get better and better at understanding the notion of the king of France and how it relates to the queen of Italy. And you go from that to the notion of transformers and understanding the way language works. And then pretty quickly, over the course of the last 5 years, you learn not just how language works, but maybe even to excavate some of the logic that's embedded in language. And that's really been the key to a lot of the generative AI work that we're seeing now. Suddenly we're being able to use these tools not just to predict the next word in your chat or the next sentence in your Gmail, but the next paragraph or the next page, and to use it to analyze problems it's never seen before, and do things it's not necessarily been directly asked to do. So one of the more interesting things we've seen is in the last month or so, our BARD tool, if you ask it, how many times does the digit 4 appear in the first 1,000 digits of pi? It will, without being prompted to do so, go off and write a Python script to analyze that question and kick back an answer. That's a remarkable level of innovation that the system is creating itself.
I don't think that it's overhyped. I don't think that we have undue attention. I think it's appropriate. I think we've seen, you have developed and will continue to develop a technology that is going to be an industrial revolution. I think we are experiencing a complete reordering of how we live, how we interact, how we move. And I think that's why it's so hard to imagine what the world will look like in 30 years, because I do think artificial intelligence will fundamentally change the way that we do so many of the operations that are a basic part of our day, that are essential parts of our lives. I think it's unfortunate that so much of it is on the worst case of the existential threat question. I think there are some people that need to be thinking about that, and I think it's a really interesting question. But I think for most of us, we need to be thinking about the AI use that is at our fingertips today. Are we violating laws on the books today? If you are acquiring AI at your company, is there a contract law that you need to be thinking about? Is it a material breach if you're using it in some way that's discriminatory? The EEOC has told us that they're on notice that you're using AI in HR functions in so many different ways, and they have laws on the books that are applicable. So I think the attention makes sense. I think the curiosity and enthusiasm is well placed. We've been telling companies for our 5 years of existence, you're actually now an AI company because you're using AI in pivotal ways. I just hope that they direct the attention to ways that are productive and ways that are meaningful today because their attention is needed there.
And if I could build on that, just to partly your question about why now, and partly Congressman Liu's point about the AI ocean versus the AI lake. AI has been all around us for a decade or more. If you use Google Search or Translate or Maps or Gmail, you've been using AI. It's just come out from behind the curtain. So people now feel it in the instantiation of these chatbots now. But it has actually been improving the way we live for quite a while. In fact, just last week, McKinsey came out with a study saying that 75% of the productivity gains that we're going to see from AI over the next decade won't come from the LLM generative models that we've been talking about. That's the lake side of the equation. They'll come from the ocean side of the equation. The way AI is streamlining a lot of the work processes that we see every day, accelerating science. We talk about the notion of doing science at the speed of digital. We have one example, our team over in London worked on a project called AlphaFold. You all probably remember that roughly 20 years ago, we sequenced the human DNA. And that was a remarkable achievement, but didn't necessarily have direct impact on medicine. Because it turns out the DNA then gets expressed into proteins. And the exact folding of the protein, the way the protein is shaped, makes an awful lot of difference in terms of what kind of medication you need. So we know from COVID, if the spikes look like this, you need this vaccine. If they look like this, you need this vaccine. It used to take a biology PhD student an entire doctoral thesis to fold one protein. That would be 3, 4, or 5 years. There are roughly 200 million proteins in the human body. The team at DeepMind, using an AI tool, folded all 200 million of them in a few weeks and open sourced the results. That's, in other words, like training every man, woman, and child in the United States of America to become a biology student PhD candidate and have them do nothing else for 3 or 4 years but fold proteins. That result, it now means that there are over 1 million researchers around the world using this protein folding database to develop more personalized medicine, advanced forms of drug discovery, et cetera. I think you're going to see these kinds of scientific advances across society, across our hardest scientific problems.
Let's shift to the question of what guardrails we have and what guardrails we need. And Miriam, I wonder, can you talk a little bit about what specific kind of standards you see emerging from the industry itself around the question of how you develop this technology responsibly, ethically?
Yeah, we have the good fortune at EqualAI to work with companies who want to lead in this space, who want to be responsible AI governance leaders. A few years ago, it was really harder to put our finger on what does it mean, because there's not national standards, there's not international standards, and obviously AI has no boundaries, and so to have legal boundaries around what is expected is quite challenging. And so we've brought AI leaders together to help navigate what does it mean to be a responsible AI actor. And fortunately, we have seen a lot more consensus on what that means. And when we look, we actually have a white paper coming out shortly so that we can share some of these best practices and learnings with the broader audience. But we've been able to see a distillation of certain fundamentals. For example, starting with a framework. You have to go into this with a basic overall view of how am I going to operate here? I'm now a responsible AI actor, whether you're a company, a nonprofit. I'm using AI in a pivotal way, hiring, financial outcomes. What does it look like? I'm going to have a framework to outline what our governance plan is going to be. I'm going to have responsible AI principles in place. And second, to have accountability. We are able to learn now from what you have at Google, what we've seen at Microsoft, what we've seen from several actors out there, and distill. You have to have accountability at a senior level. If you don't, then it almost doesn't make sense to try and get your frontline employees steeped in what it means to be responsible AI actors, because it creates a tension. They need senior level buy-in in order to be able to do this work, and they need authorization at the highest levels. So you need accountability at the highest levels. You need a process in place that is standardized so that across the organization, people know what it means. They know whose role it is. They know what is considered to be a problem that they should flag for the senior leadership. We like to call this good AI hygiene, so that there can be a consistent language and understanding across your organization of who is playing which role, and that, getting back to the accountability, that it's safe to bring up these issues, that it will be heard and you won't be penalized for doing so.
Could you make that concrete for us? I mean, what would be a specific example of bad AI hygiene and a standard that would prevent that?
So, for instance, if you don't have documentation, if you are not looking at your AI systems that are being used in pivotal ways and documenting what are we testing for and when, and making sure that you're using language that can be understood downstream. So across enterprise, as your AI is used by different teams, they should be able to understand what has been tested and when. When you're with other companies, when it's, obviously AI is being used across the world, across companies. If another organization is to use the AI system that you've built, that you've developed, that you've in some way shaped, they should know what you've tested, what you haven't tested, for whom it was built, what were the use cases that you had in mind, so they know who may not be seen or heard from the AI system that you've built. So I think that is a role that companies should do internally. I think it'd be helpful if we had some government standards so that we could have some international consensus on what this language should be, what the best practices look like.
And Ken, maybe specifically to you then, how do you guys think about this inside Google as you're developing the technology? What sort of guardrails have you?
So we've talked about the notion of building in a way that is bold and responsible together. Now, together refers to groups like Miriam's and ML Commons and the Partnership on AI, who are feeding into these processes and helping us create standards that are applicable across the industry. And I do think we are going to need to have the Underwriters Laboratory or the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval as part of this, as well as government regulation and guardrails. But just because you shouldn't trust us to check our own homework doesn't mean we're not accountable for doing our own homework. So when we're building our internal teams, we've been working on this for some years. Starting in 2018, we created our AI principles. We have developed large teams of people internally working on responsible innovation. You heard later on this afternoon from Lori Richardson, who leads our trust and safety team, that is doing a lot of adversarial testing, red teaming, to check the outputs of our various models to make sure they're living up to the standards we want to uphold. So there's a lot to be done on the technological research side, future of safety, which we and others are continuing to push forward. So there's an awful lot. It's kind of a layered system of governance. You need international accords, national accords, industry standards, and company responsibility.
I was struck by what Congressman Liu said about the UN getting involved in this. Is there an active effort to draw up some sort of a covenant?
Well, you've seen a lot of international actors. The G7 recently announced their Hiroshima process. The OECD has been working on these issues for 2 or 3 years now, putting out their own frameworks. There's now talk about transatlantic accords between the US and the EU to try and align. So this has caught the attention of almost everybody, in part because it's come out from behind the curtain so dramatically. But I think it's a welcome moment to think through what frameworks make sense.
And sticking now still with kind of what's happening organically before how Washington may now get involved, not to say that that's inorganic, but it hasn't exactly happened yet. Miriam, you mentioned that there are a lot of existing laws that already, one way or another, apply to an AI world. Is there constructive litigation underway right now that's helping create some sort of a regime for how companies think about using the technology?
It's an interesting question. Constructive I do think.
I normally think of that as an oxymoron.
Well, I do.
Or is it just bad?
No, I think the challenge is that it's happening sporadically, and that we have judges who don't have training in AI or AI governance trying to interpret these laws within these new systems. system. So I do think that is the purpose of our legal framework, that it is intended to help us navigate and interpret these new innovations and these existing precedents. So that is the intention. I do think we have some challenges, and we've been studying this for 5 years. I've been expecting to see a lot more litigation than we have seen on the civil side to date. I think we've seen a tremendous uptick, probably threefold in the past year. I think that will continue to increasingly escalate exponentially. But I think there are many areas of law where AI will be implicated that we haven't yet seen the litigation. It's yet to play out. What?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for instance, I think in contract law, I think consumer protection, I think we've seen the federal agencies in the US speak to the way that they're going to be overseeing. In addition to the EEOC that we've mentioned, we saw a joint historic statement a year ago between DOJ and EEOC saying that if you're using AI in your employment, in your HR, that you have laws that on the books that are applicable, and particularly the Americans with Disability Act. And I'm so glad that they raised that, because if you're using voice recognition in some pivotal way, voice recognition, we understand some of the challenges with facial recognition. Well, it's even more so the case with voice recognition. And if you have a speech impediment, is it going to hear you? If not, then you're looking at the ADA. We've also seen another joint historic statement between the CFPB, the FTC, DOJ, and the EEOC, again this year, really trying to flag for people the laws on the books that are applicable to the AI use, as we are all becoming more enthusiastic adopters, making sure we understand the laws that still govern our recommendations, whether they're human-based or AI-based. But that's the federal regulatory side. In the civil litigation side, obviously the IP questions are top of mind and will be pivotal to see how that plays out in the courts.
And if I might, that list of different issues really shows the importance, I think, of a hub and spoke model rather than a one-size-fits-all silver bullet approach. Because the issues are so different in healthcare versus financial services versus transportation, that having different expert agencies resolving these in different ways, I think is going to be critical to creating the clarity that everybody's looking for here. In which case are the developer liable for something versus the deployer? How much should a general purpose model anticipate all the potential misuses you might see down the line? Those are things I think the courts will work out over time.
And how much of your own time are you having to spend paying attention now to what's happening at the state level across the country in this space? I mean, how much is bubbling up from states that could really affect your business?
We're starting to see more, but it's, I think the states are watching DC to see how that's going to progress, but that hasn't stopped the introduction of dozens of state bills. I'm not aware of any broad ones that have crossed the finish line yet, but we are certainly watching.
So Miriam, turning to the question of what the federal government should be doing, or Congress or the regulatory agencies specifically should be doing that they're not, what are the areas that you think are most crying out for the federal attention?
I think that one thing that we need the federal government to do is to make sure that responsible AI work is a competitive advantage. So right now, if you're doing an algorithmic impact assessment on your AI systems, you are doing the right thing. It is complicated. Hopefully you're doing it with a lawyer, because it's got a lot of potential liability that you're documenting. And if you're doing that work, it should be rewarded in some way. It should be recognized and not penalized by creating a document that you worry about having used against you. So I think that making sure that doing this work is consistent, that the expectations are clear, and that good actors are recognized for the important work that they're doing. It takes time, resources, attention, and that should be recognized. I think we also need the federal government to be the place that spurs on the workforce upskilling and development that needs to happen to ensure that we have an AI-ready workforce, to be thinking about what are the jobs in 5 years going to look like. We know from McKinsey and others that we'll lose some 80, 90 million jobs in the next few years, but that potentially there's 120 million additional new jobs that we'll be creating. The more we can refine what will those jobs look like, they're not all going to be computer science jobs. There are many jobs that are transferable to our current workforce, making sure people are ready to more seamlessly move into those positions, making sure that companies are incentivized. Again, right now we have some really good actors who are upskilling their employees. Well, making sure that that is the expectation and that they're rewarded and that there's a public-private partnership to make sure that it is something that we're also being mindful of what people are being educated for. You don't want them to be educated only for the jobs of a certain company. You'd rather that they have these skills that are transferable.
Kent, you referred earlier to a good housekeeping seal of approval as one mechanism that would be helpful. Is that something that the government should also be providing? Is there a federal certification process? And I think this is what you were referring to, Miriam, a little bit there, to recognize the more benign players in the field.
There are a lot of different proposals floating around right now. I think the main thrust has been to focus on risk-based proportionate regulation. So if you're using AI for critical infrastructure, for example, you may want to have more of a licensing and oversight regime. If you're using it to give you your Google search results, you may not need a full-blown licensing and audit process. So what that continuum looks like, I think, is when we talk about the hub and spoke model, very much the notion of individual regulators should understand what it is that they're focused on, because all of these areas involve trade-offs, right? Do you want a secure model or an open model? And are there trade-offs between those two things? Do you want a human in the loop? Well, in most cases, in many cases, yes, but maybe not in all cases, where it might actually make your results worse or slower. How do we think through the balance between avoiding discrimination and protecting privacy? Because sometimes to avoid discriminating, you have to actually understand some personalized information about the people who are affected by your tools. So expert regulators in these different areas are well suited to trying to figure out what kind of a licensing or registration regime might make sense in their specific applications.
And here comes a stupid question, I fear, particularly stupid question, but how does recognizing the good actors prevent the bad actors from carrying out their actions anyway, if you see what I'm saying? Why is recognizing the people who are being responsible going to prevent people from developing and deploying the technology in ways that are damaging?
So I would go back to long ago, probably 150 years ago. The creation of branded goods was an innovation in America. We forget that until about 1870, you went to the store and you bought sugar or flour out of a bin, and you didn't know where it came from. And then suddenly, General Mills and others started to have branded goods, and you bought General Mills flour because the last time you bought General Mills flour, it lived up to the seal on the package. And you buy from something that has the underwriter laboratory seal of approval on it because you're fairly confident that that device isn't going to short circuit your house. So I think there is some motivation in the marketplace for people to live up to standards, especially where there's a certification regime that you can trust across the board. Now, that's not going to be sufficient in all cases, and that's not an argument never to have government regulation. We need government standards and regulation to progress the work in some of these areas. But I do think the system that we have had so far has led to innovation in America that has led the world in these areas. And I think that's something we should be proud of and expand on.
And but when you say we do need it in certain areas to progress the work, what are those areas? So
I think you can range from very specific technological applications, let's say AI being applied to the electrical grid or healthcare systems or whatever else it would be, to broader what are called frontier models, where the companies right now at the edge of this research are still working to define exactly what does good look like. What should a certification entail, and how should it be applied, and to which kinds of models? The latest and greatest models, all models, small models, big models, there's a lot of open discussion going on around that.
And Miriam, in your discussions on the Hill and elsewhere, are you pleased with the level of literacy that you're encountering, and or do you think there's room to grow? I mean, does the government feel to you like it's rising to the challenge here?
I would say yes to both of those. Yeah, there's certainly room to grow. I mean, most people didn't go into politics because of their computer science agility and interests and skills. But that said, I think we've seen people learning from their mistakes in the past. They understand that this is an area that they need to be diving into. They understand that this is an area where we need clarity, where companies that are building and deploying AI can't wait a few years for the laws to be clarified. They need to be understanding what those expectations are now so that they can be building accordingly. So I think you see, like Representative Liu, many more savvy lawmakers who are trying to dive in, educate themselves quickly. Across the federal executive branch, I think we're seeing also really sophistication. We're seeing many more senior leaders, as well as new hires who are specifically joining the government to help with emerging technologies. So absolutely more room to grow. And frankly, I mean, I think that's another area in general where we need government support. We need to have more digital literacy across our population. We need all of our students, frankly, to be exposed to computer education, digital literacy, understanding what it means to be a deepfake, understanding what it means to be using AI. When they're, they need to know when they're using GPS, when they're getting music selections or shopping recommendations, that's AI. They don't need to necessarily all know how to build the algorithm, but an area where we really need government support is to ensure that our lawmakers, but our public as a whole, is more AI savvy and can be a consumer of AI that is that understands what it is and what it's not.
Can you address the concern that a lot of people have that it always makes people suspicious when an industry asks to be regulated by the government, and the concern is that the goal is really for the incumbents to be protected by essentially by a layer of government oversight. Why wouldn't that be the effect of the government getting, or would it be the effect of the government getting involved?
I think it's always a risk, and we have seen that in the course of some tech regulation. I will say that many of the people who are calling for regulation have been calling for regulation from some time, and it's from companies as well as academia and other settings. A lot of the concerns have been around what are called long-term, maybe not so long-term AGI risks, artificial general intelligence. But at the same time, you're wanting to see an evolution of standards in this area. So alignment across, if Europe's regulating one way, the United States in a different way, 190 countries in each in their own way, that's not particularly helpful for any of the people trying to deploy these tools broadly across society. So I think at minimum, you're seeing a call for alignment. And on the longer range, you're seeing a call for frameworks, recognizing that, again, there are incredible opportunities, but also responsibilities and security risks, national security risks, to these tools in the wrong hands.
And just to follow up, I think there's, on the one hand, the national security risks, where it is a legitimate call. Companies want the government to be stepping in and establishing the guardrails. But I think even in the more day-to-day responsible AI governance, it is challenging work. I mean, first of all, to define what does it mean to be a responsible AI actor? What risks are you testing for? If you're looking for bias, which types of bias are you looking for? If you're looking for other risks, is it cybersecurity? So to have somebody defining what it means to be a responsible AI actor really would help all companies. And then if you're going to do the work and operationalize it, well, red teaming and other best practices are very expensive and complicated to do. To be able to expect small companies to be able to do that is really challenging. In addition to thinking about where the centers of research are happening on AI, I do think that there's an interest in making sure that academic institutions continue to be involved in a way that they have historically. And that's another area where I do think people are looking at, I don't know if regulation is the right word, but government intervention to make sure that all of those safeguards I just mentioned are in place.
Is the university issue more of a funding issue or a data provision issue?
I would say neither of the above. Honestly, it's mostly a compute issue. That right now, cutting-edge academic research sometimes is having difficulty getting access to some of the graphics processing units that are used to build the larger models. So we're looking at ways, and other companies are looking at ways to share some of that infrastructure, to have academic researchers rotating through, et cetera, so they can have access to the largest models to run experiments on.
How can the government mitigate specifically the national security risk? I mean, I go back again to the idea of a malicious actor developing a dangerous AI. What can the government do to defend against that?
It's a very challenging problem to say at the start. We are looking at, are there standards with regard to cybersecurity, avoiding leaks of models that could fall into the wrong hands? Are there ways of building in guardrails that could not be removed to keep some of these tools from being used for improper purposes? But ultimately, I think the best way of achieving cybersecurity is to outcompete, to have the best cutting-edge AI models that are being used to identify cyber attacks, other kinds of problems. At Google, for probably 10, 12 years, we've been using AI to detect phishing and malware attacks in Gmail, for example, or to understand people surveilling systems or doing DDoS attacks. Can we identify and anticipate those sorts of things? So I think there will be something of a literal arms race. But so far, I think a lot of our tools are, and here I mean the Western developed world's tools, are in the lead.
And it sounds like that arms race is a little bit already underway, actually. Are we reaching a point where it's getting hard, is it getting easier or harder to build the model yourself?
At the moment, it's getting more expensive because the models are getting larger and require more chips and more training. But there's a lot of interesting research going on about can you miniaturize or distill those models in ways that could actually democratize their use. So it's something of an unsolved research question on the long term. Will it necessarily be the largest and most expensive models, or will there be other ways of being able to focus the models in specific areas? There was an instance where Facebook open sourced to the research community one of its tools that was then not quite cutting edge, but then fine-tuned by other groups for a very small amount of money, $500 in one case, $30 in another, to be very good cutting-edge performance in specific areas. So that might also be a trend here. So it's a little hard to predict exactly how this is going to play out.
Miriam, I'd like to come to this question of misinformation, fraud, deepfakes, and so forth, which is a really hard problem, I think, for a society that's already struggling with trust and a lack of good information. I was struck by where Congressman Liu came down on that, which is basically everybody just needs to be more skeptical. Do you think that's going to be the answer here in the end, that there's very little else that we can do as a society to given the very important protections we have in place for speech and expression?
I think there's a multifaceted approach that needs to go into place. I think the other hat I have the privilege of wearing is chairing the National AI Advisory Committee, and one of the things that we put in the report is ensuring that those agencies responsible for prosecuting these harms have sufficient resources to be able to do that, on the one hand. To Congressman Liu's point about having a healthy skepticism, I think that's part of digital literacy. I think that's part of a broader education where we need to make sure that we have an educated public who can ask the right questions and understand what they may or may not be seeing. I think that investing, as Ken said, in AI, understanding that AI can be part of the solution if we're thoughtful about what some of the biases that we're trying to root against. I think some researchers have done some really impressive work to show the harms that we've seen come from AI, but some of those same researchers have also shown that if we're thoughtful about where these risks and biases are, we can use AI as a tool for good. We can go again in healthcare, where there's been too often underdiagnosis for patients of color, for instance, in osteoarthritis pain. We can now build tools that detect better, 2 times better, the pain in these patients of color, as well as all patients, because they went backwards and saw where that pain curve was biased based on human interventions in the past. So I think that likewise with disinformation, we can use AI as a tool for good if we're thoughtful about where the biases and harms are that we need to account for.
Ken, can you talk a little bit about how you all approach using AI to try to police
Yeah.
this area?
So to pick up from where Miriam left off, we've seen examples where 6, 7 years at YouTube, we had roughly 1 in 100 views of videos that were violating our policies. Now it's 1 in 1,000. And that's largely because we've been able to use AI to identify problematic videos before they've had more than a handful of views. So I think these affirmative uses of tools are very powerful. And I'd be a little careful about thinking about misinformation, disinformation as an AI-specific problem. We've had versions of this for many years. Politicians for many years have had distorted, manipulated, photoshopped, cropped photos or whatever else it would be. A few years ago, there was the Nancy Pelosi so-called cheap fake, where they simply slowed down a video to make it look as though she had been drinking. So we have some experience here. We need to build on the notion of mis or disinformation, misleading or manipulated media. That's sort of the standard. If you're actually confusing the recipient as to what's being portrayed and making them think something is real when it's not, that's, I think, where the line should be drawn.
And we need to wrap up here, but I'm wondering, looking ahead to the next couple of years, we're actually deep already in the throes of yet another campaign cycle in a highly polarized political environment. Do you expect to see legislation in the next Congress, in this Congress rather, in this area, or do you think it's going to take longer?
It's certainly an area of great concern to elected officials. So I think it's one of the more likely areas you might see legislation, whether at the federal or the state level. But at the end, we on the private sector, we're not waiting for legislation. We are doing work as we've announced, to try and have watermarking in the media that we're putting out, the video, the audio that's coming, so people can tell when something is out there. And we're trying to do better work on what's called provenance, detecting manipulated media out there and where it came from. So our Mandiant team, for example, helped identify a manipulated video of President Zelensky supposedly surrendering to the Russians some months ago. So again, you play offense and defense at the same time.
Yeah, to that point, I think all politics is local. Now that that's hitting home in their own elections, there's certainly motivation. I think also we can't lose sight of what we do have in place. For instance, the NIST framework. The more we can do to operationalize that tremendous resource that was congressionally mandated and released earlier this year, the better off we are. So I think, yes, we should be looking ahead to what more we need, but I think we also need to be thinking about the tremendous resources we have currently available to us.
Okay. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, James.
Thank you all.
Thank you.